Tell you. Okay, we are live on Climate Chat. Welcome, everybody, to Climate Chat. I'm your host, Dan Miller, and today we have a special guest that's known for eons, it seems like, Professor Dan Kammen from UC Berkeley. And Dan actually got his BA degree at Cornell, my alma mater, and actually he's going to give you a little bit of a bio. He's been part of the IPCC process, has been to almost every COP except for this most recent one. And so he has a great perspective on what's happening in that process. That's what we're going to at least start talking about today. We have some other subjects we're going to try to cover. I'd like, first of all, to welcome Dan, and also for him to give us a little brief background, what he studied, what the research he does, and what his government service has been. Take it away, Dan.
Well, Dan, thanks so much for having me on. It's a pleasure. And from one Cornellian to another, it's always nice to see us gathering hopefully on the side of good in this process. So as Dan said, I studied physics at Cornell and at Harvard, and thought I would either be an astronaut or a professor of physics of one flavor or another, maybe cosmology, maybe something else, but got wonderfully seduced into clean energy while working in Nicaragua under the Sandinista government that was being embargoed by the Reagan administration. And from there went to back to Harvard and then to Princeton as junior faculty in energy. And for the last 25 years, I've been at UC Berkeley, where I run something called the Renewable and Appropriate Energy Lab, or rail.berkeley.edu. And during that, I've bounced in and out of federal service when I'll say the political climate was right. And so I served early on in the Clinton administration on the Future of Nuclear's task force called the Generation 4 process. Then under President Obama, I served as Science Envoy, and my term extended or leaked into Trump 1, which is painful to say. And I resigned that job in as loud a way as I thought I could. Served in the Biden administration in the U.S. Agency for International Development, and do not think I'll be asked to serve in the coming administration. That is putting it mildly.
So I will say, just in case it happened to have been a coincidence, I will just tell everyone listening that your resignation letter under the Trump administration, if you took the first letter of each paragraph, it spelled out impeach. So that might have been just a total coincidence, so I won't ask you to comment on that. So, but...
Well, I thought the funniest thing was after crafting that letter for several hours to make sure that it all worked out to be impeached, one of the first reporters asked me, was it a coincidence, given that the President's Council on the Arts had resigned a month before and crafted their letter to say resist. And so I'm not going to comment on the state of journalism, but it did earn some notoriety, but also we hope a little bit of sting for the Trump team. And they did, in fact, have a number of challenges that came from their lack of support for science, I would say, as a result.
Sure. So we're going to get into the Trump side as well. But let's start off with COP29, which just ended in Azerbaijan. And well, the reports out of there, well, when you and I were talking about it, you said, well, we can talk about the debacle in COP29. Okay, that's the title here for the show.
Yep.
But why don't you start off by telling us what happened at COP29?
So I think debacle is the right word, although now that 33 hours after the COP was supposed to end, they did come to an agreement, but it's incredibly weak, and I'll try to describe a bit. So this COP was always controversial, being held in Azerbaijan, in Baku. Baku is actually arguably the world's oldest oil and gas city. Natural or fossil gas being burned naturally and above ground in various cities for over 1,000 years. So this is kind of the place.
1,000 years.
1,000 years of continuous flame of leaked natural gas, fossil gas. And so what happened at the last COP, where I did attend, in the UAE in Dubai, was there were more fossil fuel lobbyists there than ever before. It was the most attended COP at about 70,000 people, and almost 3,000 oil and gas lobbyists were there. And so the groan, and one of the reasons I didn't go to this one was this was even more so. This was supposed to be the COP of finance, and the argument is that if you are going to have it in a fossil fuel place, that you should at least get real money on the table and not just kind of donations and things. And so what came out of the process was a multi-month dialogue about increasing the contributions to developing to poor countries to about $1.3 trillion. And even Mary Nichols, real climate justice leader, former president of Ireland, got up and said, well, you cannot squeeze a stone. Poor countries are not going to get that amount of money, for which the negotiators from the small island states, from India, from a number of countries just said, this is crazy. We've been negotiating around this number for a long time. The final agreement came in at $250 million. So $250 billion will be the amount.
I thought it was up to 300.
300, but some of that is the current legacy money
okay.
that goes in. But the two pieces of critical context are that in COP29 in Paris, the claim was we need to get to 100 billion a year. And it took 9 years to get to even that number. And even that was achieved arguably through some dubious bookkeeping and smoke and mirrors. This quote unquote jump up to be at the level of 300 billion, not today, by 2035.
Yeah, so like way in the future.
Not around the corner. Is vastly less than any of the assessments of what industrializing countries need. And furthermore, a big chunk of the money that they just simply decided to drop out of the equation was supposed to come from the private sector. And with Trump's election, there's no question that the US is not going to pay up any share. So the mix overall is a complete, in my view, abandonment of any sort of strategy where developing countries are receiving assets they need. At the same time, the US, Norway, UK, and many other industrialized nations are now making record profits off of fossil fuels. So it's a double-edged sword at minimum aimed right at the climate crisis. So it is I think debacle, unfortunately, is still the right word.
So you're someone who's been involved in COP, so I want to ask this kind of carefully, but have any of the COPs since 1992 been successful? In the sense of, well, let's put the finance aside for a moment. I mean, the main purpose is to address the climate crisis. And the way you address the climate crisis is by reducing emissions. And the only thing that has happened since the COP have started, emissions have gone up, and we're now at record high emissions. So
we are. So yeah, two levels. One is I think that a number of COPs have been very successful. None are home runs. You don't expect that with the huge divisions out there. But on a number of the COPs so far, the push to make clean energy a base part of the development landscape and to give countries credit for investing in protection of forests and mangrove swamps and estuaries. Those all got on the agenda in some important ways. So none have been huge hits, but that is really the critical part of the process. And when we say emissions are going up, it's certainly true, but emissions in the US and a number of industrial countries are actually falling, and the US emissions have actually slowed to a halt, if not reduced. The fact that emissions are going up overall is because the emissions in many of the industrializing countries where these assistance dollars were supposed to go, their emissions are still rising, as you'd expect, because they are essentially trying to play catch up to where we are economically. And so the fact that China is now the global leader in emissions by a good factor of 2 or 3 over the next largest developed country or industrialized country emitter is not a surprise, but it does mean that the process that we're doing overall can only be given a failing grade. So I agree with you on that, but individual COPs have actually made some significant advances, including acting on the new recognition that in many parts of the world, it's now cheaper to build a new clean energy power plant than it is to simply operate an existing fossil plant. And that's an amazing turnaround, but subsidies and biases and corruption and legacy technologies mean that that's nowhere near a clean win, if you would put it that in those terms.
Well, actually, so two questions to come out of what you just said there. So one, firstly, you're perfect person to ask this since you run this renewable energy laboratory and things at UC Berkeley. Um, is the growth of renewables, which has been rather outstanding, is
Exactly.
that really due to COP at all, or is it due to the fact that China got the price of solar panels so cheap and the economics are so compelling with, with some subsidies, which I'm not sure how much are COP related versus just
Yeah.
country related. So did
So
COP play a big
really,
role in that?
right, really interesting. So, the answer is it's hard to, we don't know because COP is a negotiating, educating, we'd like to think partnership funds transfer process. It is certainly not the number one driver. That is certainly the economics that you highlight. But getting clean energy technologies, getting conservation into the wider political dialogue is not a simple process. It is like sausage making, and the COPs are a big part of that. So would a number of the large scale clean energy projects that we've seen in industrializing nations have taken place without it? You can argue that what's taken place in Morocco and in Kenya and to some extent in Bangladesh and in Chile and Mexico, each of those countries made commitments under the process. And all the countries I mentioned just now actually met some significant part of their commitment. So I don't know how you dice up what led to what, but it's certainly part of the process going forward. The other key thing I just want to put on the table is that the dialogue around climate justice, so the just energy transition, is certainly something that the COP negotiations played a key role in. The youth, the Greta Thunberg, the Alexandra Villaseñor, Vanessa Nkate, the youth movement around climate certainly gets its biggest stage at the COPs. And I would argue that climate justice is the newest and most important lever in the process, and we'll see how it fares under this new U.S. administration, which doesn't promise to be that happy.
Well, getting back to something else you just said about how the U.S. has actually lowered its emissions, my understanding is that a big part of that lowering emissions is switching from coal to natural gas, which on an accounting basis has half the CO2 per kilowatt hour that coal does. But in reality, switching from coal to natural gas raises global temperatures immediately, and they stay elevated for quite a long time before the benefits of natural gas actually kick in. So how much of that emissions reduction is actually this, I'll call it fake accounting well, certainly a very poor choice for switching away from coal to natural gas, from one greenhouse gas to a much more powerful, actually, greenhouse gas
in the short term.
In the short run, which, yeah. But it goes up, by the way, I shouldn't just say this without explaining. The reason that temperatures go up immediately when you switch from coal to natural gas are two reasons. One is that the greenhouse gas, the power of methane, which is what natural gas is 120 times as powerful as CO2 while it's in the atmosphere. It's only in the atmosphere where, what, 12 to
10 years, 10, 12 years, yeah.
10 to 15 years, something like that. And however, that's super powerful then. Plus, you get rid of the cooling aerosols from coal smoke, which is a bad thing for your health, but it does cool the climate. So you combine those two things, you immediately get higher temperatures, and the accounting is done on a 100-year basis. So they're counting the methane as being 30 times more powerful, which it is.
In the short term, it's much more
over 100 years, but we're not talking. But we're going to experience the first 20 years of that. And anyway, so that's the reasoning behind that. And what's your thoughts on that?
So before answering, I'll say it's even worse than you say. And part of it is because the US and China had already said that they are not going to invest in coal projects in other countries. That's been established policy in both countries. But neither one has said they won't do fossil gas projects in other countries. So in fact, when we look at a barrel or we look at a unit of natural gas in the US, even if it doesn't get used domestically, it now gets exported. And so the US is the new Saudi Arabia, and we can't say that enough. Saudi Arabia played a horrific role in this recent COP in Baku, but we, the US, are now the world's biggest fossil fuel exporter. And so it gets worse because essentially the switch from coal to fossil gas means that if we don't burn it, we're sending it to somebody else to burn. And so we are locking in other countries into a fossil fuel mess. So just to say it's worse on that level. On another level, though, it is actually far better. And the reason why is this is not a game of whack-a-mole where if you knock down the coal, then you have to worry about what pops up in gas and this and that. The issue is that gas is much more flexible in a changing energy environment. And so while over the last 3 years, the majority of all new energy projects have been renewables, there is this gas piece coming up. And if you want to ramp something down while you ramp up renewables, you can do that with gas. You really don't do that with coal. Coal plants get locked in fixed contracts. We have utilities around the world trying to get out of coal contracts right now. So in a world where renewables are now cheaper, it's far better to have the competitor fossil gas than it is coal. But we have to be serious and do things like we've seen in California and Europe, and that is to put a carbon price, whether it's a cap and dividend, a cap and trade, just a straight tax. And few new countries have been adding that, and I think we can anticipate there will be very little new addition with Trump in the White House, with this all energy strategy, which really means all fossil strategy.
Well, that's the same as Obama had an all of the above energy strategy, and he
all of
increased.
the
By the way,
above, right.
that expansion of the natural gas you're talking about
Yep.
was under
Started then,
Obama
yep.
and Trump and Biden. It wasn't.
Right. So all of the above no longer works. It may make some rich old people even richer, but it does nothing for the health of the planet. And ultimately, and whether it's too late or not is another whole question, but ultimately we are going to have to see serious choices made for renewables against fossil. And unfortunately, the US election was a major step in the wrong direction for that, despite the far better economics of not only clean energy, but also energy storage. And so the ability to do this is now something that we really have technically, and I would say economically, but politically, we just took a complete wrong turn.
Right. Well, okay, that's one of the subjects here. And a bunch of questions here. But what are your thoughts? Obviously, the public wasn't engaged on climate. Of course, Vice President Harris didn't mention it at all during her campaign. Well, I mean, a little bit, but very, very little. One question, I think, in the debate, not the first debate, I think, not even the second. Yeah. And so we're not focused on it. The public's not aware of the dangers, even though they see it on TV a lot, but they don't even know what's going on. What do you think this next Trump administration, what impact do you think it will have on climate change globally?
Well, I mean, I think the pathetic deal struck in Baku was directly a response to Trump, because every other donor nation, all the European nations, Japan, Scandinavia, looked at the bill for partnering with emerging economies and said, well, now we have to pick up every bit of that because there will be no US contribution. So I think you have to start right from the beginning. There will be a chilling effect on the investment in clean energy for countries that need to partner. They need a subsidy, whether it's from the World Bank, multinationals, or donor partnership countries. So that is bad for project development. And every time you don't choose a clean energy project when you have a choice, you are essentially locking in 20, 30 or more years of some fossil alternative. So very bad for the climate in that sense.
Isn't it still, though, the cheapest way, as you said earlier? Even
it is, but the problem. So the problem, and you mentioned it briefly before. The problem is that right now, if you generously add up the annual investment in clean energy, Right now, it's about $1 trillion a year globally. There's some quibbling. So some people would say it's 750 billion, some people 1.2, but call it $1 trillion is what we're globally investing right now in clean energy. Let's contrast that with the current global subsidies, not the actual capex, the capital, but the amount that we're subsidizing fossil fuels around the planet through lease agreements, through all manner of givebacks to the fossil industry is at least 5 times that. So the fossil subsidy, or the finger on the scale, is massive against renewables. And so until there's this kind of policy change that we were talking about in the Biden administration, we are going to be held hostage by all of our subsidies that are sitting to benefit the fossil economy. So all of that speaks very poorly to our ability to make a change. And by change, I don't mean growing the amount of renewables. We're actually doing reasonably well in adding new renewable capacity. The problem is we're not cutting into the fossil fuel denominator in any significant way right now.
And that I tell people that the amount of renewables is irrelevant to climate change, because renewables don't cause climate change and they don't stop climate change.
That's right.
What causes climate change is fossil fuels, and what stops it is getting rid of them. And when you look at the numbers shooting up for solar and wind, the fossil ones are just continuing on their merry way. And that's why we're not
Jeffrey
doing much.
Highlighted Jevons paradox, the paradox that as some things get cheaper, you put more. You use
by the way,
more.
a little hint for next week's discussion topic. By the way, we're going to talk a lot about that. Why didn't the? I want to ask you a very simple question. you were in the Obama administration, but Obama, again, we knew all about climate change back then. Biden, we certainly even knew more. Why didn't they take direct action on climate, which would mean phasing out, I mean, the simplest thing of all is phasing out fossil fuel subsidies, let alone phasing out fossil fuels. Why didn't that happen?
So 2 different administrations, even though some of the same actors, but different contexts. So the Obama administration arguably didn't do it because they were initially focused on healthcare. There was a kind of a very complexly set up Waxman-Markey Act that would have basically been a larger subsidy effort into the ethanol bioeconomy than it now looks like would have made any sense. That effort didn't pan out. And while Obama made some progress on...
Which Obama didn't push, by the way.
No, he did not. And as I said,
he didn't like go in there and try to get that passed.
And part of that,
he just said, "Okay, let's see what happens in the Senate."
Right. So the historical view on that now is a young president, not really empowered in the DC infrastructure, chose a lot of old timers who were not pushing radical stuff. We had certain individuals at Treasury and elsewhere who were really not interested in this transition at all. So the president himself didn't push it, which is arguably a mistake, but you can look at the context. In the Obama administration, arguably the biggest change that happened was something that looks very small now that it felt like a big fight then, and that was to get vehicle efficiency standards increased. That is nowhere near enough. That is a paltry measure overall, but that was arguably the biggest climate advance at that stage. Biden, to his credit, started out with a very clear and strong agenda. The 2 or maybe 3 really interesting things that Biden did even before the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the biggest US investment in this area to date, but came about through a very interesting route, was to say on day 1, we are going to set up a social cost of carbon, meaning we're going to jump beyond whatever the market price of carbon is to what we think the environmental and the human rights damage is. That got immediately stuck in the court system, took over a year. Biden then went on to say, I want to see a zero carbon energy sector by 2035. Well beyond his administration. And that effort was essentially applauded by the liberals and just laughed at by the conservatives. The other critical thing that Biden did that I'm hoping some of this legacy really will continue is that he said 40% of our expenditures on infrastructure will go to low income, marginalized, fence line communities, something called Justice 40. And Justice 40 was a direct translation from California's Justice 35 to the federal level. We will see what happens with some of those investments. The White House office that Biden set up is not likely to survive, but the investments may go significantly. So while it's also true, as you intimated before, neither Obama nor Biden, and certainly not Trump in the middle, reduced our growth of fossil gas. They did put a lot of the structures in place to promote renewables. They are now going to be seen, rightly so, as far too timid, given how strong the climate crisis is and the degree to which during the next 4 years, we are not going to get any federal support, to put it mildly.
So I've had, you certainly have, and I've had a little bit of interaction with the Biden administration. I was actually on his Energy and Climate Committee pre-election. We're coming up with policy ideas and things like that. And so on this show, we cover things like accelerated climate change due to ship emissions reduction, and we're at 1.5 already, on our way to 2 next decade or so. I mean, pretty soon.
Going to be soon. It is going to be very
and also the AMOC collapse, which is getting more and more attention recently, which is a clear and present danger to the United States and every other country in a short time frame. I mean, well, decades, not, but still.
The military is already seeing climate change as the biggest existential threat.
Okay. So why, given that, and on this show, which is not, I don't know, it's not like we have access to more information than the government does. It just appears that these administrations are not taking climate change seriously.
Not at all.
Period. And these are people, they have smart people in there, I know, that are talking about how serious climate is. I know they also have political leaders that maybe get their ear even stronger. But can you give us a flavor for why the government doesn't?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is unfortunately, sadly simple, and that is the U.S. is a house divided, a term that goes all the way back to Lincoln. And it's so divided that the blue states, I mean, arguably starting with California, then Washington, and now New York is a very strong player, Massachusetts. The blue states are operating essentially not in the same political structures, but essentially with the same goals as the European countries. And the red states are living in 1970 something. And so we are completely separated on this. And part of it makes perfect sense. Most of the clean energy jobs that we are talking about today are going to go to current blue states. The high-tech hubs, the Silicon Valleys, the 128s.
Iowa and Texas have WID going crazy in Iowa.
They are, but they are only building that now. And so we need to be much more equitable in where the jobs go. It's actually why was supposed to be a hallmark Obama administration, the so-called Clean Power Plan, is one that I thought was one of the best structured deals. The Clean Power Plan was essentially a plan to reduce emissions by 1/3 nationwide, but each state only competed against its own baseline. So it wasn't like a slow-moving southern red state was competing directly with California to meet their targets. In fact, Kentucky, because of the switch away from coal to wind and natural gas, found that they were actually a clean energy leader because their baseline was bad.
Horrible.
So there are ways to make this palatable, but in such a strongly divided house, it is easier to gloss this over. And if the public isn't calling for it across the country, which we are not, as you pointed out, then it does get second fiddle. And I agree. I think that Harris, who lost in essentially the same way that Hillary Clinton lost, the electoral numbers were not very different. If you are going to be not Trump, you should actually be not Trump, and you should actually campaign on the things that you think. The fact that she didn't say in every single campaign stop, there are more jobs in clean energy than dirty, and my administration is going to guarantee those investments go to so-called red states. She wouldn't say
she said we're not going to affect fracking in Pennsylvania, is what she said, right?
That's right. And so by taking such a soft pedaled perspective, it just didn't make sense in terms of playing to the strength of the clean energy economy and adding up the climate disasters that we are seeing as essentially a tax we all pay, and we can move out of that world. And now what we're doing is basically ceding the clean energy leadership to, depending how you want to think about it,
China,
European countries, or really China.
China's going
exactly right. Now, China is going in every direction at once. Leader in manufacturing clean energy, but also leader in installing new coal. And that is exactly the recipe you highlighted at the beginning. Nature doesn't care how much renewables we add if we don't reduce fossil. And that's not the path that China is on at the moment.
But while we're talking about this, because you mentioned that the public didn't demand that Biden and Obama, act on climate. Yeah, that's true. But the public doesn't really know what's going on. But Biden and Obama did. They have the best resources available. Climate scientists tell them what's really going on, if you know what I mean, not just what's happening like right today, and the risk that we face as a nation and as a world. So why, and if you do have a house divided, one way you deal with that is say, oh, by the way, we just got information that China's about to invade, so we're going to deploy everyone. No one's going to stop you, when you're fighting a national emergency. Yet there was no national emergency for climate. Neither Obama, or Biden made it a serious issue. I mean, they talked eloquently at times about it, but they didn't, put
we've had a lot
the Republicans in their place by making them try to argue that it's not an important issue, right? They didn't have to. Say anything.
We've had way too many eloquent speeches and way too little action. And I don't even think it has to be partisan. The fact that the Joint Chiefs of Staff have now come out over a decade ago saying climate is our #1 existential threat beyond the geopolitical ones that we create or contribute to in Asia with China and Taiwan, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. So why they didn't push for this is, you'd like to tell a complex, long story. I do think it's the perception of the ungovernability of a climate agenda in such a divided country. But at the same time, the economic wins in the clean energy economy are large. And you can start out with a process that puts resources and tracks job creation as a way to convince more state legislators, legislative budget offices that this is a good investment, if for no other reason than the global shift to renewables is significant outside of China, but it is significant. And one of the opportunities for job growth in US companies is to be on the leading edge of that. And that economic story, why it didn't come out more clearly in the budget offices in Obama and Biden, I think is one of the lost, it's one of these tragedies that seems under the radar, but it's really one of the key ways to influence industrial policy towards clean energy. And we did not step forward on that, or on how we can link the justice development angle much more clearly to a clean energy plan. Those are both very readily doable. They're done in states like California and New York routinely, not at the federal level.
Yeah, but I'm saying something different, I think.
I know.
So Adam McKay, we had Adam McKay on here a little while ago, and he recently made a video of a guy walking into a restaurant, and it's on fire, right? The building's on fire. And he yells, "The building's on fire, everyone run." And they was, keep your voice down, please, and speak at more respectful. And so he starts saying, "The building is on fire, and I do suggest that you all run." And it was like this absurd situation. That's our situation. We have the building on fire, and people are saying, "Well, let's talk about the this, that, and the other thing, and jobs over here." We're talking about a clear and present danger.
Well, let's take.
Is there any way to change that? I guess to get more.
Let's say the building that Adam's video walked into is actually a restaurant. And I think
That's what it was. That's what it was.
exactly. So the equivalent is you walk in and you order the biggest meat and cheese, high cholesterol, mega calorie, and then you order a diet soda. And you say, well, I'm balancing that. And that's how we've treated climate. It has not polled as a top level issue. We collectively have not made it clear that all of these damages we're seeing, the crop issues, the mega fires, the heat waves, are all as clearly tied to climate as they are. If we added up one small fraction of that, we would clearly see climate is the biggest long-term driver of insecurity, of cost. And we have been afraid to do so because we haven't been able to build this case. The case is that and it sounds so simple to any environmental scientist, and that is the economy is a subset of the environment, not the other way around. And most economists in the old days basically said, the economy is the thing, stupid, and environment is one little sliver of that pie. And that worldview has to flip. We have done a bad job of making that case.
Yeah, okay, but again, you were someone in the government, so I'm going to try to get your perspective a little more. Rather than the public will rise up, but the public's only going to rise up when the shit is hitting the fan so much.
You can argue,
and as we all know about CO2 lasting for hundreds of thousands of years in the atmosphere, that point is way too late. Yep. You can argue it's way too late now, but the push to get the public engaged, to get public support, should be coming from the leaders. I know the leaders are the followers. Yep. Is there anything, let's say after the next Trump administration, is there anything we can do that would, I guess climate damage is going to do it, but is there anything short of enormous climate damage to get political leaders to lead? I guess that's the question. So,
boy, that is a whole show question, but I would, let me do it from the micro up as opposed to the macro down. We have clearly seen, sadly, that mega fires and droughts do not seem to be enough to move political leaders to lead, nor the public to say, wait a second, we're only going to elect people who recognize this. There are other critical crises that are now looming. The world, for example, has about a 55-day supply of food on hand. Meaning, if we stop production tomorrow, we wouldn't descend into the Mad Max world for a few weeks, not longer, because food is one of those basic things that causes revolutions, uprisings, etc. And one of the forecast outcomes of climate change is that these disasters are going to begin to significantly affect food supplies. We've already seen supply chains disrupted and I don't mean to put it mildly, but just by COVID-19. And so if food now and fuel becomes issues, we will see those crises. Those are the things, sadly, that our data so far shows that's what it seems to take to get political leaders to highlight. But it's really the issue of the lily pads on the pond, right? If the lily pads are doubling each day, at what day do you notice it? Some people say when the pond is half covered. And that's one day before it's fully covered, right? If the number of lily pads are doubling each day. So we are terrible at long-term planning, and the US may be the worst place at it because we have such a economic frontierism mentality. Climate change is that used to be sneaking. Now, I would argue with these crises, it's overwhelming. And in fact, the number of $1 trillion climate crises we see just in the US is now very high. So should those leaders be acting on it? Yes. But in a land of fossil fuel plenty, and in places like New York and California and Washington, renewables plenty, that fossil fuel story is still winning by far.
You think the AMOC collapse story, which has really come out of nowhere, I mean, I know we've been talking here for a long time on it, 3 years or so, but in the last year, so much research has come out saying that the chance of collapse is much higher than thought before. And the paper just a few days ago confirmed what Jim Hansen said a few years ago, that the IPCC modeling was incorrect. And when you correct it, It shows
So just to back up, so for those who weren't on the last show, so AMOC is something that's been studied now for over 2 decades, and it's the basic picture that there is a global circulation of warm and salty water in the ocean. There's a heat transfer in the ocean system, and if that conveyor belt shuts down, it essentially takes temperate Europe and pushes it into the temperature zone that it would have been otherwise. It dramatically impacts the amount of circulation of nutrients. It is a sort of a global scale disaster. And all the way back to Suki Manabe, a physicist who has now recently won the Nobel Prize, there have been studies about this process. Jim Hansen, you mentioned, and many others have looked at it. And it's not even the only one of these crises out there. We are now talking about methane seepage from the seafloor and tundra overturning with trapped methane. And we've talked about why it's a short-term gas. So the number of these horrific global scale surprises in the greenhouse is large. And it's one of the many reasons why the science only picture sends you to, we need to make this the existential threat that it is, and yet these all feel like creeping issues, so we pay little attention to them. But AMOC, absolutely. As we get new modeling, we find that the risks are higher and higher. We have seen global sea surface temperatures taking wild oscillations in the last few years, far out of anything we've seen historically. It sure looks like our negligence and our poor management of the climate is not biting us in 20 years, but it's starting to bite us now.
Right, but the AMOC is different in the sense that if you miss 2, you could still go for 2.1, you could still go for 2.2. You could, I mean, we're not going to even get close to those. We're going to be way beyond. But the damage is unknown. I mean, people don't have a feeling for what that even means at 2 degrees, even though it's utterly catastrophic. But AMOC is on or off. And if it's off, in 20 years. By the way, there's a little delay between when
I would say several of these are these binary switches where we could do catastrophic climate damage, weather damage, food insecurity damage very quickly. That is the emerging science. And that, that's great on this show, but that really has currently virtually no footprint on the mainstream media right now. This is just
or I say the government. I've been in
science.
touch with people in the Biden administration about this, and the fact that I'm kind of bringing it up to them that scares me, to be honest.
Well, I mean, right, but this is part of this overall process that we have not figured out a way to make our long-term health, even our children's health, which you think almost everybody can have some resonance with. Oh, I might be okay for my remaining years if I'm in my 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, but my children are going to absolutely suffer. And we are setting up not just our grandchildren. And Jim Henson used to talk about, had a book called Storms of My Grandchildren. Now it's the storms of our children and the storms of our reclining years. And I hate to have the conversation too much at this high level, and not details about what could we do about clean energy and about investing in forests. But it is absolutely the case that we are literally fiddling as the climate is burning. No question.
Well, let's move on to something then that is certainly something you work on. People might not know this. You spend a lot of time in Africa getting renewable energy systems put in place. And just when I look at this, and I'm not nearly as involved as you are and know the details of this, but renewable energy seems like really cheap. You don't have to rely on some unreliable fossil fuel supply chain to get you there every single day to keep your energy running. You build it and you got it and it's clean and it's yours. How, renewables are very cost effective in the United States. How do renewables play in the global South, in Africa and other places today? And where are they going?
Yeah. So complex question. The first thing I think just to say critically is that there are a number of African and Southeast Asian and Latin American countries that are making significant progress. Kenya is now 94% powered by renewables, largely.
Really?
Because they have fantastic geothermal energy, and they have some of the best wind energy on the continent. Morocco made a major switch by investing heavily with the king and a lot of the royal mechanisms and tools, making Morocco into a solar thermal, an energy storage, and a wind leader. We have efforts in Bangladesh that are very exciting around distributed clean energy. There's something I'll talk about later in just a bit called HEDA, which is basically trying to electrify the roughly 100,000 health clinics across the continent with clean energy to meet the health needs. But because renewables are so cheap, as you mentioned, to overbuild, so each health clinic, which is an anchor customer for clean energy, can become the hub of a mini grid or a metro grid or even a larger scale. So there are some exciting efforts going on. The East African Power Pool with clean energy in Kenya and in Ethiopia, much of that being hydro, which is another topic, are core countries in a region that could go largely clean energy. So all of that sounds good on paper. And then you get to the political leadership question. And to expect cash-strapped African heads of state and African parliaments of Senate to do things that we are not willing to do here, with the US now exporting gas everywhere, with Norway making money by exporting gas despite being clean at home, with the UK doing the same, what these leaders say is that we are cash-strapped. We need investment to do these projects, even if they're good for us in the long term. And you're offering us a pittance for clean energy, but you will subsidize massive destruction of the Congo system for timber and oil and gas blocks. The same is true in the Gulf of Guinea. The same is true in Southern Africa. And we know that if we work with you to build some big clean energy projects, this is going to go much slower than essentially giving in to some big fossil fuel companies that you, the North, are supporting to do projects in our country. So don't expect us to take all the technical and political risk when you guys are, in fact, doubling and tripling down on fossil fuels. And that's where the COP29 debacle shows up. Every single minister of finance who is from a poor country who's coming home this weekend from Baku says, if I want a project that's going to go into the ground in my lifetime, I'm going to get much more bang for the buck by going with these big fossil fuel projects from the North. It sends exactly the wrong climate and job signal, but politically you have to understand exactly why these ministers and heads of state say, this is what the North is really telling us they want us to do.
So what I'm hearing you say is that when a global South country wants energy, it's not just they're not using their own money and going to China and buying cheap solar panels, which are pretty cheap, but they're getting money from these other countries, except the money they're being offered is fossil subsidies,
absolutely,
not renewable subsidies.
Right.
So they kind of get it for free, or they get the capex maybe for free, and then they're locked into paying for fossil fuels forever, right? But
absolutely, but
selling the drugs, the needle.
If you're a minister or a head of state, the most important thing on your agenda is the next election or a popular enough situation so you don't face a coup or any kind of change in government. And that's exactly the same here. So doing a big fossil project in the US is in many ways no different than doing the same project in Africa, in the sense that you're not just spending money out of your piggy bank, your national treasury, you are financing it. And if you want to get a fossil project financed, it is easy in the global scheme. And even if you can get an individual clean energy project financed, like the Lake Turkana wind farm, where Google and others were investors, although they sold that share off, they didn't want to stick into a long time despite their clean energy perspective. We are making it very hard for countries that are industrializing to trust us to do clean energy projects when that's not what we are doing ourselves at the national level.
Now, renewable, though, is pretty amazing in that it's dropped, batteries dropped 90% last 10 years.
Same as solar.
Solar dropped 80%, wind dropped 60-something%.
Yep.
And it's going to continue, don't you think? I mean, maybe not quite that level, but close to those levels. And so 10 years from now, let's say, even with fossil subsidies, you would think that renewables are going to be so incredibly dirt cheap that you'd kind of have to be crazy.
Right, but remember,
a quarter of the cost of what it's already cheaper, and now it'll be a quarter of the cost.
Yeah, but those arguments are all true, but they are based on the cost of a project over its lifetime. We discount money so heavily We chose not to go with what Ken Arrow, the Stanford Nobel laureate in economics, said. We should have a declining discount rate, which sounds like a nerdy little tool, but to say, we'll let banks work in these high interest rate, these high discount rate settings in the short term. But in the long term, we're going to send that interest rate towards zero because we value the planet, we value our children. That proposal has been around for decades. And the first serious action was Biden saying we're going to use a social cost of carbon, which never ended up going into force in any way, even though he.
And how much was that?
So the social cost of carbon is the analysis that let's figure out what each additional ton of carbon costs us on a damage basis. And it turns out that number is something like 100, let's call it $200 a ton. There's a big error bar, but $200 a ton. The market price of carbon in California is about $35 a ton. So even in green California, we are still telling polluters, we want you to pollute because the atmosphere and the ocean is a free resource for you to vent your waste. And so if we don't get at all serious about not just saying renewables are good, but changing the financial tools that this COP was supposed to be about, with this 1.3 trillion, which came down to 300 billion, that you have to align your finances with your values at some point. And we have so far proven that we love writing papers about it, but we're not willing to do it.
So you're $35, $200. So I had David Archer on the Climate Chat a long time ago when we were just on Clubhouse, and he did a calculation of what the social cost of carbon is if we don't use a discount rate.
Yep.
And that number was $27,000 a ton, because the damage continues for about 500,000 years. I mean, not all of it's at 500,000, but
right.
a little bit happens at 500,000 years. Right. And this is about, and he didn't even include like the loss of our cities in the near term, because he figured over long periods of time you shift cities anyway.
But so while I like David's calculation, the problem is that's exactly the direction we can't go, because none of us are going to say, well, let's add up the cost over 500,000 years. It is environmentally true, but it's irrelevant financially. And so
he wasn't arguing to do that, by the way.
I know.
It was sort of an exercise.
Right. But the argument has to be add up the benefits in the short term. And the benefits in the short term are very significant. There are more jobs in clean energy. But right now, in the US and in China, it's almost exactly the same story. Those clean tech jobs largely go to New York, California, DC, Washington State. In China, it's in Beijing and Shanghai. And the places that are currently major fossil fuel producers, for us, Wyoming, West Virginia, Montana, for them, Shaanxi province, those places are currently set to see huge unemployment. And so anyone that is leading a house divided, as the US is going to shy away from these things that guarantee to lose them votes and to lose elections. So we have to align, and we have to make the investments in clean energy truly a just transition. That means we need to invest in former fossil fuel communities. We need to invest in marginalized immigrant communities. We need to make the investment not one that just benefits what we currently in the US call white collar workers. And that is something we have not done under any administration, Democrat or Republican, since the New Deal back under FDR.
So, well, I guess I'm going to finish up my question. There's other people that will give a chance to ask questions here, but just very generally, what suggestions do you have going forward? Let's put even Trump aside just for the moment here, in terms of changing that narrative, changing the action plan, to moving to serious action from what we've been doing. What do you think people in the climate community have to do, political leaders have to do? What do you think we should be doing?
So, I mean, there's a couple aspects of an agenda. So leaving aside what we're likely about to face under Trump, there's no question that we're not going to jump from a low price of carbon to these massive values overnight. But we need to start with the banking sector and to reward clean energy. Connecticut, New York, California have each done experiments in having green banks, some public, some private. Those need to get investment. And I am disappointed, and I'll unfortunately have to call out a colleague and a friend. We just had 4 years of Secretary Yellen as Secretary of the Treasury, and we did not put any significant federal push into rewarding green investments over fossil. And that is a missed opportunity no matter what the politics is. So globally, we're going to have to work much more significantly on that. Marshall highlights the European Union's climate bond as a way to essentially have money available for green projects, and not always in green areas. One of the interesting emerging success stories after a very disastrous coal-dominated COP meeting in Poland some years ago, Poland is now investing significantly in wind power. And it's those investments in fossil fuel havens that need to be highlighted. So one aspect of this is certainly greening the banking sector. The other one is doing appropriate training. And so what Morocco did is, I think, a model for all of us. And that is, when the king pushed to make Morocco a clean energy leader, he also pushed the university system, which is directly reports to the king, to say every university needs to launch a new department of energy engineering or of recycling or of green energy finance. And not only did that build in Morocco a remarkably robust and talented group of young people, but it also made education far more diverse. You go to any engineering department around the world, and notably in Africa, and it's largely dominated by male students. In these new energy engineering departments, women were 40 to 60% of the students, because it was a new area to go into. And so linking financing and education, and something that we have not figured out how to do at all, and that is giving young people not a ceremonial, but a real seat at the table. And this is again, the climate youth argument. And we have not seen that effort. We trot out youth people on stage at various meetings to give a TEDx talk here and there, but we are resisting in all kinds of ways a intergenerational and a justice-based form of government. And those are three areas, even before we get to cool technologies, that would help to reorient society around our own future. And so to me, it's a bit like the cartoon. There's two aliens looking at the Earth and saying, oh, I think we've detected intelligent life there. Look, they have atomic weapons. And the other alien says, yes, but they're all pointed at themselves. So they're not that intelligent. And that's what we're doing with climate. We recognize the problem. We write nice papers. We have a few nice movies, but we're unwilling to center it in our economy, even though it is the biggest threat we face. And justice, I think, is one of the biggest tools to center it.
Let me ask you one tech question here. You also studied nuclear power. There's a lot of talk about small modular reactors and fusion and all these things happening. They're not really getting traction right now. And also some people in the climate community certainly think it's a terrible thing to do, and others think it's the only thing you could do. But what are your thoughts on the future, let's say, next 10 to 20 years, the future of nuclear energy as a climate solution?
So I guess a disclaimer to start off with, and that is that I am an initial partner in a tabletop fusion energy company. So
okay.
I am kind of bullish, to put it mildly, around fusion's future, although it's not going to save us this decade, that's for sure. So even though I'm a professor of nuclear engineering, I remain skeptical about the climate benefits of small modular reactors. I think we will have them. Google just put a $5 billion investment down. We are going to see them built. But the problem with small modular reactors is that they are, by design, essentially small versions of our current big reactors. They don't dramatically change the waste management issues. In fact, if anything, they put more faith into some private sector billionaires to manage our waste well than federal systems. So there are some real challenges there. I am bullish about fusion because we now have a whole range of fusion companies. More than 10, I would say, have a reasonable shot. We know from the Livermore laser version, not the version I think is going to be a commercial model, but it shows that we can do on the surface of the Earth what the sun does. So it's a proof of concept, not a proof of a business model.
Right.
But I do think that in 2070, when I will, I think sadly for me, certainly be gone, I do think the world will be roughly 70% powered by fusion in 2070, but half of that fusion will be 93 million miles away, meaning I see a world in 2070 that's on the order of 35% solar and 35% fusion and the rest made up by others. So I am very bullish on the longer term path for fusion. I think we will have the first fusion reactors working in pilot or early commercial scale within a decade. And I have colleagues who think that's folly. It'll be 2 decades. But I do think that's on a really strong path. I'm much more concerned about the fission, the conventional nuclear path right now, because I don't see our big advances as ones that are going to change the climate story. I think they're going to make some individuals very rich. We have some very promising fusion companies here in California. We have some interesting liquid metal or fast reactors and other types that look like they will do well. But around the planet, we have about 420 nuclear reactors today. Every single one of those would need to be replaced by equivalent capacity by 2050 just to maintain generation scale, let alone market scale. And that right now looks well out of the economic or the integration into the grid picture. So I have to be banking on fusion because I don't see anything else that is disruptive like that.
We're going to have one of your execs from that fusion company.
Yeah, this company is called Alpha Ring, but there's many out there. There's Tri-Alpha, there's Linear Fusion, there's a whole bunch. But they are all, at the startup phase, and it takes a while to get anywhere. And only right now, just to reiterate, only right now, NIF, this massive 196 lasers focused on a target the size of an eraser, has demonstrated they can do it. Although I think many of these new companies will actually achieve fusion too.
That's cool. That's cool. Well, that's a kind of I don't know. It's a positive thing to end on, at least for my set of questions. Other people be unhappy to hear it, but we should make the distinction that fusion doesn't actually generate, if you do it right, the radioactive waste that fission does.
Well, that's exactly why it's so attractive. It does generate some radioactivity in the metals you take out of the fusion device over time. But yeah, no radioactive waste. The fuel is water. One little, not so trivial, little irony is that the fusion systems we need require tritium. And tritium is not naturally available to us. The global supply is on the order of 30 tons total. And we only had one nuclear reactor type that made tritium, and that was the Canadian CANDU reactors, a program that is closed.
Right.
So we are going to need to reinvest in tritium, as well as the broader process of getting some of these fusion systems to actually work.
Well, actually, I know of a
so there's a lot of hurdles.
Company working to solve that. I can talk to you about that offline. I don't think it's something to talk about here.
Yeah, it is exciting.
So let's move on. Thanks, by the way. What a fascinating discussion so far. And now we're going to invite Stacy, our co-mod, with her question, and then maybe she might have some from YouTube as well. Hi, Stacy.
Hey, Jan and Dan. Good to see you. And say hi to Peter Liu for me. We met a few months ago.
Fantastic. He's the CEO of Alpha Ring, this fusion company I mentioned.
Yeah. So I want to rewind a little bit because you were saying that U.S. emissions reductions are coming to a halt or slowing, and
we'll see. But we have seen a good trend in the last little bit.
Well, and of course, I get very sensitive about this because I feel that the United States is almost singularly the problem. China is coming online, of course, but as mentioned, they're doing more in renewables and they have more people, and how much of their emissions are due to manufacturing. And of those goods that they manufacture, who's the biggest customer? And we don't have to take credit for those emissions. China gets stuck with them. The CO2 it doesn't leave the atmosphere. All of it is still up there from the first chunk of coal that got burnt.
It doesn't care where it came from. It's still up there.
And we're responsible for 1/4. We are 4% of the world's population, but we are responsible for 1/4 of all emissions in the atmosphere. So, and on a per capita basis, like no one, I mean, yes, like Saudi Arabia, they're off
Canada,
the charts.
there's a couple others up with us, but we are the big pig. There's no question.
Yeah. So it's like,
What's the question, Stacey?
Saying anything, it was more about the characterization earlier that it's like, oh, well, we're doing well. You know, it's like, I fundamentally disagree. Like we would have to, until we start sucking it out of the atmosphere, I don't feel that is a truthful characterization, or it's a very, it's focusing the lens in a way that.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I mean, what I was saying is that in the last couple of years, we have seen the U.S. coal industry contract to a point where if any of our green billionaires wanted to do a major plus for the planet, you could argue they should buy the coal industry. Its capex is about $40 billion today, and close the thing. And just say, let's get this one off the table and let's fight the fight around two things that you highlighted. One is, and Dan highlighted as well, one is methane gas emissions, and the other is taking full responsibility for the life cycle. And when you say a product made in China using coal that is bought in the US, those carbon emission numbers do get tagged to China. That's absolutely true. One of the most interesting signs, and there's a lot of lack of success in the Inflation Reduction Act, but an interesting aspect of Inflation Reduction and the CHIPS and Science Act is that we actually did see solar cell and battery manufacturing rising in the US right away. And that's impressive, but you're right, it is absolutely the first step. And what one version of the story is that in our House divided, even if you get a good step for a couple years, it's against a likely backdrop of a swing the other way. And so when I was just in China last month, and I'll be there again in 2 weeks, you know, they say, you may not like our political system, but we do analysis, we set a policy, and our goal is to meet it. Whereas your policy structure in the US is, if anything, to set an aggressive policy that you think you won't meet and then see if maybe you can get close, or it's something that you're doing for votes or politics or local, and then you back off it, within 4 years. So our system seems weak to do it, but our system has also been a critical part of the global innovation driver. And so there's a good and a bad in both of the kind of the Chinese and the US parts of the story. The last
I would agree with that for sure.
What's that?
I would agree with that. Yeah, that it's the double-edged sword. We have a lot of good to offer, but we have a lot to. I don't know how we will ever make up for what we've done. And you were saying about to get votes, and I wish that she would have talked more about climate, but I will defend how she did it because, I mean, I live across the bay from you in San Francisco. This is the truck that was idling for 40 minutes. They left at 10:41. They were idling from when it was like, oh my gosh, am I being punked? Like outside my window, this illegally lifted monster truck is idling outside my window while climate chat is going on in San Francisco. If that is happening in San Francisco, that is happening everywhere in this godforsaken country. I mean, it is.
And remember what we do, and kind of back to Dan's point, and then we should go to Nadia after this, but one of the things that we do here is that if the US sets a strategy around fossil fuels with a little bit of marginal renewables on the side, that has a huge impact on global lending and on what other governments see as where the real dollars are in terms of, if you want a project financed that will get you elected or keep you in power, we send a very strong international signal with our actions, and our actions have been bad, as you highlighted. So I certainly didn't want to in any way marginalize US emissions or the US being the climate pig in the room, no question. However, China is also complicit with us in some unintended ways, in the sense that they are the biggest manufacturer of clean energy technology, but they're also by far the biggest installer of new coal plants, of which they have no intention to close, which is partially why China said our climate goal is 2060, which is far too far in the future. Not that ours at 2045 is any better, but we are going to have to bump those forward. And everything we've talked about today is the reasons why we're going to miss those goals. We're not even going to make them.
To your point that you just made earlier, China's saying they will do it in 2060 and us saying we'll do it by 2045. I believe they're 2060.
You shouldn't
I
anymore,
don't believe our 2045.
Yeah, but unfortunately you shouldn't, because a significant piece of China's plan was to see nature absorbing some of the carbon they're emitting. And it's clear that because of industrial policy and land use policy, that sink in nature in China is going to be much smaller than they anticipated, which means that unless China starts to proactively close newly built coal plants, which is not likely, they are certainly not going to meet their 2060 goal, just as unless we were to have had, a Harris-Walz administration that won by enough of a landslide that they could actually do things, and we didn't see that either. So
okay.
Let me move it to Nadia, but I
no,
don't.
No, actually, we're going to go to Eli first,
want.
and then we're going to go to Nadia.
Okay, sorry.
So thanks, Stacy, and now Eli, our other co-mod, will ask a question, then we'll get to Nadia.
Thanks, Dan and Dan. So actually, first a question and then a comment for you to respond to. The question, you mentioned seafloor methane clathrates. I also agree that this is a woefully underestimated problem. I wanted to both ask some specific questions, but then to get you to sort of translate them for a general audience. From what I've been able to see, there is scant data on the mapping of clathrate deposits on the Antarctic margin, especially. And geologists have looked at the climate record in regard to say, well, we see sea level rise and we don't see huge spikes of clathrate, so there's not a strong coupling between the two. However, that sea level rise has been far more gradual, right? So that the degradation rate can take care of it. But if you exceed the sea level rise, right, and so you're dissociating lots more clathrates over a shorter period of time, I would imagine that you will agree that can lead to a strong spike that is not like anything that the geologic record speaks to, number one. Number two, pretty much a year ago, there was a paper in Science that...
Wait, before you go on to number two, do you have a question on number one, or are you just making a comment there?
Well, I want to get Dan's feedback and elaboration on this.
Yeah, so Eli, my feedback is very simple. You're right. And what we see in this case is like a number of the other ugly surprises in the greenhouse. Several of these could be disastrous by themselves, but the fact is that we are basically rolling these weighted dice against ourselves by not acting is the critical story.
Okay. And this is something that could blindside us in a short period of time if we're not
absolutely.
Right. Yes.
We got a lot of blind sides coming here. We're going blind.
So then the comment for you to respond to, it's clear from the outcome of COP29 and what you said about it that both the U.S. and the COP process have been single points of failure in our attempts to address climate, and maybe we should look to the successful strategy that has worked for the internet, which is to route around faults and specifically, what I look to is developing discontinuous technological paradigms, specifically relating to exponential manufacturing. In other words, a factory makes a factory, combined with in-situ resource utilization, and that can, for instance, drastically reduce the cost and difficulty of producing photovoltaics.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in, Eli, right there, just because it's a fascinating topic, but it's long. But let me just do I'm not doing justice to what you're raising. But one of the reasons why that may or may not be an industrial strategy that certain countries take, a real looming challenge is that most of these kind of accelerated industrial strategies become very low on jobs, very high on automation and on robots. And that's not necessarily a bad thing in terms of industrial production, but just like we're seeing job loss in the taxi sector as people look for autonomous vehicles, these are exciting technological options for the affluent, but they widen the gap, not narrow the gap, in terms of the fact that if we're going to make climate a frontline issue, it's got to not just be for entitled elites. It's got to be a broader strategy. And these, what you're talking about moves away from that. But your question warrants a longer answer than I know.
Yeah, and that's not something that we really got into here today.
I think there's a different angle than the one that you're making, but perhaps we can take that up in the future at some point if I can reach you on LinkedIn, I guess, or what's the best way of
well, you can get through me, Eli, so we can hook you up. And Nadia, welcome to Climate Chat. What's your question for Dan?
Hello. So I guess my question was that I think your strategy might be a little bit too oriented toward, I guess, nations as something of monolith in a way where, I guess you're saying that the house is divided, but you're also probably saying the lines it's being divided along, and I think that the class power, I think, is a major factor here because, in effect, it's a group of kind of wealthy interests defending the wealth of their group, right? So,
so what's your question?
That's to maybe more directly factor class power into these assessments where you're speaking of different countries being divided or having some kind of stance on climate or whatever.
So I apologize. I mean, I do agree class is a big issue, but just if you can just give that sort of in a question form, because I'm not quite sure which aspect you want me to.
Well, basically, I think that there is a. I think the way to ask it as a question would be something on the order of like, how would you maybe recast your idea of about the USA being an unreliable climate partner in terms of I guess
class politics
in the United States? Go ahead.
Okay, so apologies if I don't quite get what you're saying, but I do think
Nadia asked it in YouTube, and if I may, because it's actually a brilliant point. I think what she was saying is not just internationally, where we are on the top of the the top of the GDP pile, but within our own nation, we have this struggle of the 1% winning everything, and that the people down below, they don't understand that the IPCC and the COP itself are set up to more obfuscate and confuse people than to actually say what's going on. And so the people at the top just keep winning and making money.
What's the question, Stacey, then? What's the question?
And the people at the bottom are not.
So Stacey, I don't disagree with that, but just okay, so let me try to answer. And again, I hope, Nadia, I kind of get this on target, and apologies if I'm a bit off on it, but there is no question that the dialogue kind of that we're having and that goes on in negotiated circles are largely around empowering the already affluent, whether you are a rich New York banker or a rich electric vehicle maker in formerly California and now Texas, or whether you are a clean energy entrepreneur in Kenya or Bangladesh. So there's no question that the elites empower elites. That is sort of the definition of the term, and that's why power is collected. But at the climate level today, while we have some nice examples, they are largely subsumed in a larger world where governments are the key negotiators, the key deciders of funding, and those governments, to the most part, are still massively beholden to the fossil fuel lobbies and elites and funding. So there's no question there is a class issue in here. You can argue it's actually it's one of the core things. Why haven't IPCC, say, type authors been able to really demonstrate the benefits of the clean energy transition to people who are truly working class, who need to worry paycheck to paycheck, and we have not made that translation. So I don't know if that's what if that's the core of what you're asking, but there is no question that we perpetuate, benefit for the rich. And what I often say in my classroom is that in the US, we have definitely perfected the art of having socialism for the rich and capitalism for the poor.
Right. That's true. Well, okay. Thank you. And thanks, Nadia and Stacy. So, Dan, it's been a really interesting time. We talked about a lot of different things.
We did.
And in the end there, we started covering some new subjects as well. I think we could keep going on every subject we had for another hour, so we're not going to do that. I want to thank you for your time. And by the way, there's links to Dan's UC Berkeley page as well as his personal page in there, and links to him on Twitter and Blue Sky. So you can follow him there as well. And by the way, that reminds me,
I use Blue Sky now, not Twitter, just to highlight.
Oh, okay. You still have
Dan Kammen at bsky.social is the one I use now.
Yeah, a lot of climate people moving over to Blue Sky, everyone. But speaking of these things, please like and subscribe, like the video and subscribe so other people will see it. If you want to do a very simple thing for climate, that's something you can do. It's just clicking on those two links. And that will boost this kind of information getting out to the public, which is really critical as we're talking about here today. Dan, thanks so much for all the work you're doing around the world, helping
thanks for me on.
the global
come back, and maybe we have some happier things to talk about.
I want to talk about desktop fusion. I mean, that's pretty cool. And there's a lot of cool things happening in that. I'm aware of some other things, as I mentioned to you. So, but thanks for all the work you're doing. Thanks. Just for everything. Thanks for coming on the show and having a great discussion. And I'm glad we kept it sort of in a sense at a higher level, talking really about these political issues and the structural issues, because it sometimes gets lost when you dig into some of the details there. So I really appreciate that
thank
discussion with you today.
Really good questions. I know we didn't do them all justice, but hopefully we continue this in a bit. So thank you.
And thanks everyone for coming to Climate Chat. We'll see you next week. We might have a discussion show next week on the rebound effect and Jevons paradox, which I think is actually a much bigger deal than the climate community gives it credit. So look forward to that. We'll see about that. So take care, everyone, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, Dan. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.